Earlier this year, we entered a competition for microhomes. While the competition seemed geared towards creating small apartments for professional millennials, we chose to look at affordable housing for essential workers in the metropolitan centers. In the story of Genesis, and I am not going to be the rabbi and scholar here, so this is my little Jewish connection. In the story of Bereshit, Adam and Chava are forced to leave the bucolic Garden of Eden. Their sons, Cain and Hevel, choose the two archetypal ancient occupations. Abel became the keeper of sheep, and Cain became the tiller of soil. After killing his brother, Cain must leave his tribal land to relentlessly wander the earth. Yet, when his son Hanoch is born, he builds the first city. So it is this nomad, homeless, a-national person who starts building a city. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he then founded the city and named the city after his son. It is Cain, the outcast, the nomad, the criminal, the one who can no longer return to his home, who in the biblical narrative is the builder of the first city. So as we see, cities have always been the center of not only economic, scientific, religious, and artistic exploration. Cities are home to both the successful and the wealthy, as well as the working class, the poor, and all those others who don't fit in anywhere else. In February last year, I wrote a short op-ed responding to a court decision to revoke the building permit for the top 20 floors of this Manhattan luxury condominium on Amsterdam Avenue, because it used what the judge called, gerrymandering style tax lot assembly tactics to request excessive floor area. So the pink zone in this, that's what they called their site. They bought all these alleys and put them all together. I suggested that the court should not require this developer to demolish these floors, but rather they should be converted into affordable housing. This was my little sketch showing how we could take these large apartments and create smaller ones. Just a few weeks later, life in the dense urban city came to a halt. We were instructed to shelter in place while ambulances howled through the cities of New York. The number of dead climbed daily, and a field hospital was set up in Central Park. I had a nightmare about dying alone on a cot in the Javits Center. Many of us, white-collar, upper-middle-class professionals, quickly adapted to the new reality. We figured out how to work from home. Our kids continued school from their bedrooms, and we were able to get almost everything we needed online. The outside world was scary, but we were safe in our own homes. And this is data from cell phones where they tracked how people stayed at home or where people were. And you can see that the blue line of the wealthiest people stayed at home a lot more and much longer. So while the educated and wealthy had the luxury of staying home, the city's low-income families, immigrants, and communities of color faced heightened challenges. Healthcare frontline and essential workers continued working, risking their health in order to provide for their families and keep the city functioning. They traveled on subways, buses to get to their jobs, exposing themselves to contagion while commuting, meeting customers, and working in tight, inadequate conditions. For weeks, we opened our windows at 7 p.m. to clap for these heroes. We expressed our gratitude and appreciation to those who made sure that we could buy toilet paper in the supermarket and that our lobbies were attended. Cities developed complex multi-agency emergency plans. I now realize that these healthcare and frontline workers were New York City's human resilient infrastructure. They were our pandemic emergency plan, keeping New York going and making it possible for us to survive. If frontline workers are the infrastructure that allows the city to function, it is incumbent on us to prioritize these underserved and undervalued communities. New York City's real estate exposes the city's socioeconomic inequalities. Manhattan's luxury residential market seems to be rebounding. At the same time, the Department of Housing and Preservation, which is responsible for funding and maintaining affordable housing, suffered a 40% funding cut that could result in the loss of 21,000 affordable housing units throughout the city. Because apartments on higher floors command greater views and increase their value, developers have been experimenting with adding empty mechanical voids to buildings in order to raise the upper floors. A tower at 50 West 66th Street includes 198 feet of empty mechanical void, raising the building to 775 feet. The prevalence of these unoccupied spaces throughout the city presents an opportunity to rethink affordable housing and to integrate it into luxury buildings in centrally located neighborhoods. We call our proposal the Micropolis home. The Micropolis home is a micro home designed to be incorporated into existing spaces within the metropolitan centers. In this diagram, you can see the new yellow units inserted into the space originally designed to be demolished at 200 Amsterdam Avenue. The Micropolis homes are modular, prefabricated, energy efficient, and cost-effective units that can be installed in already built spaces. In place of the developer's 3 large apartments on each floor, we can build 16 smaller homes, serving up to 600 new residents on 20 floors. So you see in pink the existing, then we remove all that and we put in our new little yellow boxes. Each unit is an efficient 270 square foot apartment. This is kind of part of the competition also, the competition rules. It features an accessible bathroom, a kitchen, living and sleeping space. The staggering of these units creates balcony spaces for almost all the apartments. And large public outdoor terraces provide space for socializing, co-working, and for children to play. The Micropolis homes could help alleviate the affordable housing shortage in New York. Installing these units in wealthier neighborhoods, this diagram shows these units in the empty mechanical void of the condominium I mentioned at 50 West 66th Street, will improve living standards for communities of color, immigrant groups, and low and middle class families. Research has shown that a child's home zip code is one of the best predictors of adult success in life in the US. Living in a better neighborhood will provide families with access to daycare, education, safer neighborhoods for their children. Essential workers often bear long commutes, burdening them with lost time on transit and increasing their risk of exposure on public transportation. Creating these homes in central locations will decrease these risks. I realize there will be a resistance to this proposal. Few privileged communities welcome low or middle income developments in their neighborhoods, let alone in their own buildings. And this is some of the protest about the homeless shelters in hotels on the Upper West Side. But there are also many who realize that part of being a just society is implementing housing justice. If we learned anything during this pandemic about housing, it is that humanity is deeply interconnected. We thrive together and we fall ill together. It also exposed the inequities of our society. It is unacceptable that the communities that kept our cities working were also the ones who suffered the most and received the least support. From the days of Bereshit, when Cain built the first cities, cities have always been the home of diverse groups of people, welcoming the outcasts, the nomads of all kinds. Our modern cities, including New York, are financial, intellectual, and innovation powerhouses. But we now realize that their strength depends not only on financial profitability, but also on resilience, on the ability to withstand catastrophic and unexpected events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. It is therefore not only our moral obligation to create more equitable housing supply, it is also a necessary part of the city's resilience plan, one that acknowledges its human capital and the central work roles of healthcare providers and essential workers to our city's stability. Chapter 2. So I was now going to talk a little bit about the plans we developed over the summer for SAR. And keep in mind, we're zooming here from one field to another, from one typology to another, from the city to the school. So radical flexibility was actually the first challenge that we got from the principals of SAR when they asked us to see how we could reopen the school in September 2020 during the pandemic. We actually started working on this quite early in the middle of May, even before the last school year ended, knowing that if we needed to do any construction, that would take time and that we needed to think fast even before guidelines were provided either from the city or the Department of Education or the Department of Health. And this kind of work, like almost any real architectural and probably other project, was a real collaboration, and nobody could do it alone. So there was a really wonderful team, both within the school and advisors and professionals who put this together. We started by kind of listing the core values, and the main challenge was, Zoom is fine, but we want to bring the kids back into school. There are about 2,000 students and teachers in both the lower school and the high school. And we wanted as many of them to be able to be in school as much of the time as possible. We started by really seriously analyzing the buildings and their infrastructure and systems. We looked at the HVAC, we looked at what available space was previously used for non-teaching things that could be converted into a classroom. We knew that we would need more space for students if we were going to have social distancing. And so we were going to take over the lunchroom, the gym, the library, the principal's office, the financial team's office, and convert everything possible into teaching space. We also realized that going from the ELC to the high school, there was a really big range of ages, and that each age actually needed us to think about them separately and specifically. And so we came up with a different plan for every age group. So the youngest kids were in small pods. Everyone was going to wear masks and as much as possible social distance and be in school the entire week and day. The middle school was kind of a mixed hybrid, which I think was probably not our best idea, but it is what we are doing, which is pods of 15 kids with a component of Zoom at school. So it was important to bring these kids back to school because they're a little too young to kind of manage their own learning at home. But in order to give instruction at the various
I just lost sound. Anybody else?
Yeah, I also.
Do you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Thanks for saying that. And then so the middle school have this hybrid, and the high school kids, because we could not fit everyone in the building with social distancing, all students would have 1 day of Zoom a week from home, knowing that they're at an age where that was not detrimental, or at least we don't think it is. These are the plans for the lower school showing all the pods. There are about 9 pods for each grade instead of 4 classes. We took over and utilized way more than ever before the outdoor spaces available for tefillah, for movement, for lunch. And then really spacing out rooms, changing the air, upgrading the air conditioning, adding new bathrooms, and really mapping out how this would all work out. In the high school, because the schedules for each students are so complicated with the various electives and tracked classes, The attempt was to keep classes at 22 to 26 kids, but make it possible to social distance. So that means each room has to become about 30 to 40% larger. And so you can see on the top slide, the typical classes, how they were. And we removed these walls and took over this kind of public milling around space, which I guess milling around is not really a COVID desire, and enlarged all these classes. And in other floors, we combined 2 classes into 1 class, which is why we weren't able to house everyone at the same time. So this is mapping out all the different rooms. The different colors are different grades, and the yellow are teaching offices and spaces, purple is assembly spaces. And we put that same information on a chart. And this is showing how we laid out all the different desks and teachers and offices. So these are the spaced out classrooms. It was also important to the principals that there would be some opportunities for students to be in a larger group than just their classes. And so for some assemblies or tefillah, we did figure out how many people could fit in the larger spaces throughout the building. And in the high school especially, they had never really used the outdoor space much. And so we put up some tents, and those were used for classes in the fall, lunch, and all kinds of other fun activities, and hopefully are going to be reused again in the coming months. So taking a deep breath and going into my last little vignette. And this is really a much more personal, rather than architectural project, kind of introspective mini essay on prayer in the pandemic. And thinking, and maybe to tie this, thinking a little bit again about who does the city belong to? What do we do with our public spaces? And how do we come together as community? It's Friday night. We're standing in the paved plaza beside Riverside Drive. The air is crisp and fresh. The snow is sparkling like diamond dust in the setting sun. We're 6 feet apart and masked. I can't wait for this combined phrase to become obsolete. We are joined by the Chazan chanting the Jewish Friday evening prayer, welcoming the Shabbat as the sun disappears over the Hudson River. Come, my beloved, towards your bride to welcome the Shabbat. Suddenly, I'm choked up, no longer able to sing. My eyes fill with tears and emotions. I have sung these words almost every Friday, every week of my life. That's about 2,500 times. But tonight, these very familiar words feel new and deeply moving. Perhaps it's the beauty of praying outside. Kabbalat Shabbat, the prayer welcoming or literally accepting the Shabbat, is a relatively new prayer service. It was added in the 16th century by the Jewish mystical Kabbalists in the holy city of Tzfat in the Galil. They got into the habit of leaving the city and walking out into the nearby hills and orchards. Out in nature, they sang and meditated about God's glory as it manifests in the universe and in history. This new service was an instant hit and has become part of our prayer book canon. But for most urban dwellers, it's a rare occasion, maybe in a high school Shabbaton or a weekend trip, to practice it outdoors as the Kabbalists did. Early in the pandemic, our congregation, the Chinam, shifted to outdoor services. We thought this would work during the summer. None of us envisioned the weekly services continuing outside through the bitter New York winter, but it did. Perhaps it was the link to the origins of Kabbalat Shabbat, the repetition of the practice through good times and hard times that moved me so much. We often forget to notice the magnificence of nature in the hyper-urban concrete and glass landscape of Manhattan. Prayer is a strange thing. We try to deeply connect with our pains and gratitude, speak to our hopes and regrets. We say these words to ourselves with a divine intention. Prayer is something that should be so personal and private, yet I find it most meaningful when done with the community. I have come to see communal praying as a bit like therapy. In therapy, we learn to hear our feelings, accept our pain, and cherish our joys. But it's hard, if not impossible, to do this work alone. We need someone, the therapist, to help us see ourselves better. Someone who can give us permission to feel sadness and encourage us to celebrate success. Community can play a similar role. It legitimizes and creates place for deep emotions. Together, we dare to say that life is fleeting and that the universe is vast, that history has awful moments and that humanity can be inspiring. We can hold these disturbing, conflicting ideas together because we are together, and together we feel safe and accepted. This need for community is so fundamental that the number of people who attended our show has grown even as the temperatures dropped. Praying on a public New York City sidewalk felt exposed and vulnerable at first. Some people stared, others took photos on their phone, or lingered while their dog sniffed a shrub to watch or even join us. Are we allowed to do this? I wonder if those who use the same spot for yoga on Sunday morning feel the same discomfort. The reclaiming of public space has been one of the surprising joys of this pandemic. Restaurants using the parking lane for seating and closed streets becoming plazas for bikes and pedestrians. I realize now how many things we could do outdoors if our cities were designed to facilitate these activities. I hope we move towards making outdoor life in our city more easily accessible to all its inhabitants. The pandemic stripped our service to its bare basics. We worship without space, without chairs, in dim light and no heat. I realize that this is all we really need. A committed group willing to stand together in the snow and sing. The Chazan sings in synchrony to the darkening skies. He who removes days and brings night, God is his name. It's getting harder to read the small print in my siddur, but I know the words by heart. The lump in my throat loosens and I breathe in the cold air. Mark Cousins, a wonderful architectural theorist, said in one of his lectures that although philosophers will not tell you this, the sign of real truth is that upon hearing it, one breaks into tears. That night, I felt I was touched by truth. Was it the pain and loss of the pandemic? The fragility of life? The support of togetherness? I'm not entirely sure. But at that moment, it was real, and it was worth bundling up and seeking it out in the freezing, snowy Friday evening. I wasn't expecting to be emotional. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther. One thing is very clear. You have been working extremely hard in the last year, designing so many different spaces and really helping all of us and so many of us continue to function in a very real world way. So
and it's funny because all those things are not actual real work, which is something else I do.
So I'm gonna open up the discussion with the kind of big question, and I'm apologizing a little bit in advance, and you can take up any part of this question. But in your last example, which also brought tears to my eyes about the experiencing of Kabbalat Shabbat, moving it from the space of a shul to the outdoors, to the Soldier and Sailors Monument, completely, as I understood what you said, transformed your experience of prayers that you had said your whole life. So you have said that by designing exteriors, we create interiors. And I love that idea. And I'm encouraging you or asking you, wondering if you can reflect on the bidirectional nature of that idea, that our external environment impacts our internal experience, and also to think about with us how our psychological needs, our interior environments may influence how we design our public and private spaces, particularly in our post-COVID world, where we are going to have all kinds of unique needs that we're just beginning to imagine. So feel free to kind of take any part of that kind of big question, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Esther. I think that's a big question. I think the interesting thing about architecture, and I think we could tie it to many other parts of our Jewish practice, is that, you know, my job is to create space. So we want to create, let's say, a school. But space is that ephemeral thing that's in between the walls. What I actually am designating are the boundaries of this space, the delineations of it. I can't really form space. I can only kind of work on its exterior skins. And I think that's really interesting. I think that's something that I think about also in terms of, you know, our practice of halakha. We can't form an interiority of a person or what does it mean to form a community? What does it mean to form a ethical life? But we can create these kind of boundaries. And that's where we put the work, I think. It's those kind of actions that have an implication that's an interior resonance. And I think how does the pandemic change our way of thinking about buildings? I'll just maybe say a few things just as a beginning thought. So when we think about architectural spaces, and I was talking about the fact that we design that skin between the inside and the outside, they're really these kind of membranes. They create an inside, so they have to create privacy, they have to protect us from the sun, they have to keep us warm, but they also are open. We want to see daylight, we want to hear the birds chirping. So it's always this balance between how much we want to bring the outside in and how much the inside can kind of connect to the outside. And I think that's a question that impacts a lot of things that are both related to the pandemic and also our kind of heightened understanding of sustainability. That this edge between inside and outside is kind of changing maybe. And I think we want to be very careful about how much energy we use. So maybe our buildings need to be tighter. We maybe want to think more about how, I mean, COVID-19, thank God, doesn't transmit just by, you know, opening your window or touching surfaces. We now know that's not something to worry about too much, but we now are aware that things that we were not thinking about could actually come and attack us. And so what kind of materials we try to develop, what kind of filtration systems we try to think about. I think these are questions that we're going to be really curious, and hopefully, you know, smart engineers and scientists will be working on, and all of us will think about, you know, again, how we see that connection. And the other thing that I think we kind of forgot about a little bit before the pandemic, at least here in New York, is how important outdoor space is. And, you know, suddenly someone that has like a tiny little balcony was, you know, had this amazing asset, right? And we usually thought that, yeah, in New York, who needs a balcony? There's so few days that are actually pleasant to sit outside. So I think thinking about providing more indoor, outdoor spaces, providing more places for people to meet outside, making more public space available. I think that's going to be something that I hope kind of we as a city, we as a society think about.
Thank you, Esther. I want to shift. Susan Hornstein asked a good question that I'd like to pose. That derives from your work at SAR. She says, all design begins with an assumption. The original design of SAR assumed that gathering in casual groups was a priority. COVID design assumes the need for more separation between people. How can we use design to facilitate separate togetherness?
So that's a great question. So everyone who knows SAR Academy knows that it's this kind of crazy place where, 1,000 kids are all talking at the same time. There are no walls. And there's somehow this kind of, for most people, happy creative learning going on. It's obviously not the right place for every person or every student. It actually was really interesting because in the way the flexibility of the space and that big openness turned out to be an asset, something that we at first were very concerned about. Like if we want to put groups of 12 to 15 kids in one classroom so that contagion won't go from one pod to another, that was completely impossible. But actually with the help of a really wonderful mechanical engineering expert, it turned out that this big space, because it has so much air flow and so much air to dilute the contagion from a particular pod, actually probably was much safer than had we had to put the kids, in small classes. And the other big advantage that turned out was that we didn't have to demolish that many walls, as opposed to like the high school. We just moved around the furniture and, took away the principal's office. So it's interesting because something that was designed to be a big open space and seemed like that was, possibly a real problem turned out to be a real advantage. And I think it was one of the reasons that we were able to kind of so quickly transform that building in a way that so many schools were not able to find solutions. And, I have to say that while I feel very grateful to have been able to do this work for my daughter's school, I also feel really pained and almost guilty that so many other children in the city didn't have this opportunity. And some of it is leadership and autonomy, and being kind of a small, nimble institution that doesn't, it's not like the entire public school system that all has to have one rule for 1 million kids. But it's something that I think we should keep in mind of, that, we are fortunate and we have to find ways to kind of spread that within a wider range of communities.
Thank you. Erin, do you want to ask your question, Erin?
Sure. Esther knows I have so many to ask her, but I just posed one, which was the following. Do you think our orientation toward buildings themselves, like indoor spaces, constructed spaces, will change? And what might appreciation for the outdoors do to urban sentiments and urban design?
That's a great question. I really hope that our kind of urban planning and urban design is affected by this in a good way. I think we realize that parks are incredibly important. I mean, there's no, when they say, oh, it's so expensive to build a park and, Central Park could never be done today. It's hard to quantify there's no way, I think, to quantify and to measure the effects of having outdoor spaces for all those who live in a city. So I hope there's kind of a renewed appreciation for that, and for trying to also make sure that all neighborhoods and communities have that asset. And that's really kind of a public, seeing that as a public amenity. I hope that we don't, we're still in this, we're still living through this, and this is still a traumatic experience. I mean, people are still dying in our city every day, and around the world. And I think, you know, we still feel odd about even, you know, spending time indoors with other people. I think my parents are a little bit over that now that since they're in Israel and they're a little ahead of us in this. But I do hope that that the associations that we have of being in intimate settings with other people indoors, having a Shabbat meal, that we can let go of that being associated with danger, and we can kind of rejoice in that when that's safe again.
Thank you. We have maybe time for one more question, because I just want to give Erin an opportunity to sum up and end the day. Just taking a look. Esther, any other thoughts you want to share?
I have so many thoughts, but
I assume so.
I think the one last thing I would maybe want to bring up is, which maybe is another kind of thread through these three vignettes, is the importance of community. I think the pandemic was kind of our response to the pandemic, or the way to be safe, was the opposite of being together, was to keep distant, to stay at home as much as possible, to interact with people through screens as we are doing now. And I think in all three stories here, both bringing essential workers into our neighborhood communities, being able to daven together, and having the ability to send our kids to school for them to learn together. I think there's, you know, something irreducible about being with other people in the kind of most primary physical way that can't really be replicated. And I think we're going to enjoy Zoom and use it. I'm assuming it's going to be part of our life going forward, but I think that primary connection to other people is something that brings joy and meaning, and is really an essential part of our existence.
I certainly couldn't agree more. Yes. So just one last thought from Erin, and I think on many of our minds is, you know, our public spaces have become private spaces. We do yoga in the park, and we daven in the park, and we meet our friends in the park in ways that we didn't always before. And our private spaces, you know, have become public. We have minyanim in our backyard, and people see into the interiors of our homes through Zoom, and all kinds of curiosities are piqued. So it just any kind of last reflections on that idea of kind of the merging of the public and private space. Just any last thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to Rabbi Erin.
I think there's something healthy about this kind of blurring of the boundary between indoors and inside and outside. I think there's a side, you know, obviously we have to be careful, and, you know, there's some private things that shouldn't happen outdoors, and there's some peeking into people's private homes that is also inappropriate. But there's also, I think, some dangers when we keep those completely isolated. And one of the things I was thinking about, especially earlier in the pandemic, when most kids were home, was, you know, we heard about the increase in abuse and in violence. And I think one of the dangers of homes being completely isolated from the gaze of people outside, or your teachers or your counselors or is that can also hide things that are dangerous. And so I think there is a healthy balance between these two, and I think that is something that I'm assuming that over the next period of time we're going to all try to think about and study.
Thank you so much, Esther. I look forward to not only seeing you again in prayer space and on Zoom space, but I actually look forward to seeing you back in our Maharat Yeshiva. I know that you were influential in designing our Beit Midrash, and I look forward to a time where we could all be physically together in that Beit Midrash again. I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Aaron.
Okay, so thank you so much to Team Esther, to Esther Altmann for moderating, and Esther Sperber for your always brilliant and kind of intertextual, intersectional thinking. I find it always so very, I don't know, generative, but thank you. And to all of you who have been with us today, it's been quite the day. So a deep thank you for your time, for your attention, for your engagement. And I really do hope that this has been an opportunity to open up or to begin a process really of processing a time in all of our lives that has yielded so much uncertainty and also a little bit of creativity along the way. Esther Sperber's presentation of the Metropolis Project can be found on the Plagues Project website. And so we come full circle. And I hope that in the course of the day, as we've looked at cultural and historical and theological and spatial orientations toward plague, we're coming out hopefully with a little bit of insight, maybe a little bit of healing, and I hope at least some enjoyment in kind of resting in this area, discovering what we might yet find as we hopefully emerge from this space. So really thank you. And on behalf of Maharat and 929 and Bina and the JCC of Palo Alto and Judaism Unbound and OOI and Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. And I really hope I didn't leave anybody off. I just really thank you all for being here. Recordings will be available for most sessions to all those of you who've registered. And I hope that you will continue to think about these matters together, read the book if you so desire, and come join us back again for other opportunities to learn in the future, God willing. Thank you.
Thank you to Rabbi Aaron. Great to see the Sperber family.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, maybe in Central Park at Musaf.
Yes, or
Thank
even
you
in
so
my
much.
home
Oh, wow.
over a Shabbat meal.
That sounds great. My kids are very tired of my food. Thank you, Dada Carol, for coming, and Abba Nima.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you.
You can end it.
Okay, bye.
I'll leave
Bye,
here.
everyone.